My name is David Benjamin. I'm an assistant professor in the architecture program at GSAPP and also director of the Advanced Studios. I want to welcome you to Architecture and Artificial Intelligence, the first in a series of events that aims to explore how the advance of artificial intelligence throughout our contemporary world may impact the built environment and also vice versa. Of course, you probably already know artificial intelligence is much hyped and overused, and it means many different things to many people. Many accounts of artificial intelligence may start with the Turing test in 1950 and go on to chart the rise of machines advancing in playing games against humans. So these kind of accounts describe the epic battle in 1997, shown here, between the world's best human chess player, Garry Kasparov, and the world's best computer, IBM's Deep Blue. In the first game of the match, Deep Blue made a highly unusual play, sacrificing a rook well ahead, which seemed to hint at a sophisticated strategy. Kasparov was rattled. The game ended in a draw, but Deep Blue went on to win the match. The chess world found this devastating. And years later, one of the inventors of Deep Blue revealed that the fateful play had been due actually to a software bug. In the end, the computer won not because of an innovative strategy, but because the human was prone to worry and doubt and self-destruction. So Kasparov had assumed that machine intelligence worked like human intelligence, and therefore the unusual move must have been a sign of superiority, but actually the computer had a different intelligence altogether. More recently, another computer, Google's DeepMind, defeated another human, Lee Sedol, in the game Go, which was once considered a game for uniquely human intelligence. It was thought that Go was impossible for a machine to win due to the nearly infinite number of outcomes and the difficulty of calculating which player is leading at any given moment, the difficulty of creating a metric. The victory of DeepMind may signal an age of computers being able to solve specifically human problems. Google's computer used big data and machine learning, and the potential of these technologies for all kinds of applications is stunning. But these techniques involve some results which in some cases can be troubling. As with all technologies, machine learning involves assumptions and biases, but the assumptions of machine learning may be even more troubling than other assumptions because sometimes they are hidden even from their own inventors. This concept has been articulated in recent writing by people like Kathy O'Neill and Kate Crawford, who have shown how the biases of these algorithms can lead to things like racial profiling and policing, sexism in job listings, and uneven distribution of resources in urban neighborhoods. And these arguments imply that understanding algorithms requires understanding the humans who create them, the humans who are also, in some cases, displaced by them, and also the humans who are affected by their conclusions. Perhaps the battles of chess and Go and the growth of machine intelligence that they represent suggest that it is important for all of us, I would say as architects, but also as citizens, to become more fluent in algorithms. It's important to understand what's going on under the hood, including the bugs that these algorithms contain, the data they are based on, and the rules that lead to their conclusions. This is crucial not just to be able to use the algorithms effectively, but also to be able to guide, temper, and respond to their use. In other words, AI is a political issue as well as a technical issue.
Boxcar 2D. The game in which you don't actually do anything other than sit.
Thank you for turning that sound out. That was not meant to. Oops. And it's not playing. Not sure. It was playing?
No, it's still playing. It's still working.
Oh, it's just not moving. Well, anyway. So to kind of wrap up here, in the context of these ideas, I think it's relevant in this kind of session for us to address what does this mean for education and for architecture. So one of the provocations that I've been thinking about a lot over the past couple of years comes from the neurologist Richard Burton, who describes a cognitive dissonance that occurs as machines become smarter and smarter. But Burton compares human intelligence to artificial intelligence and then goes on to argue that the ultimate value added of human thought will lie in our ability to contemplate the non-quantifiable. Machines cannot and will not be able to tell us the best immigration policies, whether or not to proceed with gene therapy, or whether or not gun control is in our best interest. In other words, since machines cannot worry, and since machines cannot worry, and since worry and doubt are productive in creating humanistic, fair solutions to the problems of our time, humans will never be replaced by machines. But then Burton goes on to argue that in this context, what we need in education is not necessarily to get better and better at programming machines, but instead to develop the opposite, to cultivate the cognitive skills that won't be replaced by machines, to reinvest in the humanities, and to save the literary novel from extinction. So it is in this context that we've organized today's event. It's meant to be open-ended, to cover a range of work going on in AI, from architecture and from other fields, that may influence and even redefine our field in the coming years. Some of the questions we may explore include what kind of assumptions and a bias might accompany machine learning for the physical world, what specific roles and jobs in the design and construction industries might be replaced by automation, and what new forms of literacy and criticality are necessary in architectural education and practice. We'll have 3 speakers today, and I will introduce them very briefly now up front, and they will then present each with a short presentation, followed by hopefully a good amount of time for audience questions and for reflection and discussion. The first speaker is Julie Dorsey. She is a Yale professor of computer science and the founder and chief scientist at Mental Canvas. Julie came to Yale in 2002 from MIT, where she held tenured appointments in both the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science and the School of Architecture. Her research interests include material and texture models, sketch-based modeling, and creative applications of AI. She's received several professional awards, including MIT's Egerton Faculty Achievement Award, a National Science Foundation Career Award, and an Alfred P. Sloan Foundation Research Fellowship. I actually changed my mind. I think we'll introduce the panelists one by one, and so I'd like you all to welcome Julie, and I'll introduce the other panelists.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, David, and thank you for organizing this session on such a fascinating topic. I am a researcher and professor in the area of computer graphics. Just about all of my research over the years has been motivated or informed by architecture in some ways. And today I wanted to talk about 2 topics, that of material appearance design and drawing. Both have a very rich and interesting history, but I think they also both have very interesting futures in the context of AI, and particularly with respect to architecture. So the tradition of appearance model is a very old one, and one of the reasons I find this topic fascinating is that both scientists and artists have theorized about the appearance of the natural world for a very long time. And for example, Rembrandt and his contemporaries during the 17th century were fascinated by the problem of creating realistic flesh tones. And so they kind of developed these models in which they put various layers of lacquers and paints and pigments on a canvas, and using that kind of set of layers, they could build up and mimic what real skin looks like. And on the other end of the spectrum, scientists have also been fascinated with appearance. For example, the 19th century classical physicist Lord Rayleigh was really interested in things like why is the sky blue? Why do butterflies, feathers and bird feathers look the way they do? Or why do butterflies have this kind of iridescent pattern? What causes that? And also other questions about appearance at different kinds of scales, but all from a kind of physical standpoint. Today we use these kinds of insights, I think both from artistic and design disciplines, as well as physics and related disciplines, to develop computer models that can be used to make very, very realistic and accurate models of materials. I'm just going to say a little bit about what goes into a material model. And I want to get to the idea of what role can artificial intelligence play in helping to describe material appearance today. So a material model, when we look at a material, it's really composed of three parts. There's a spectral component of the color. There's a kind of directional component, which is whether it's shiny or matte or glossy. And then spatial variations, or high resolution texture. Now, if this gives you an idea of what it might look like on a real object, on the left we just have a perfectly kind of diffuse or matte surface, and then we've added in a spectral component, and then a directional component. And then finally you can see a spatial component where the texture is varied across the surface. Now, unfortunately today, in most computer systems, this is kind of what you're looking at in terms of developing material design. This is an example from Maya, but we could look at also something like Rhino. What you see here is a huge array of parameters. Many of those parameters, it's not just the sheer number of things that you're tuning, but also there's this idea that many of these parameters don't actually have any sort of physical basis. They're just kind of made up, they're like hacks. And that's actually how we specify materials often when we're trying to design something new. You can also, of course, bring in things from off the shelf, but I'm really intrigued with the problem of how can we actually design new appearances. So we've done a lot of work, my students and I, in things like texture modeling, material modeling of various kinds. This is one example of kind of bringing in real-world examples, learning about them, and starting to integrate them into simulations, and eventually maybe into new buildings. So for example, we could take this exemplar that you see in the upper left, and when we look at that, we sort of want the most dominant texture there, but instead if we just sort of grab it and synthesize it, we end up with this kind of odd looking frog instead of the one that we want on the bottom. So how can we kind of recognize from images the most salient features? We've done lots of work from exemplars. For example, in the upper left, you can see some terrazzo, where we can take from a single picture, actually synthesize the statistics of that into a volume of material that you see there. We can also do things like taking arrays of images. We can obtain an array of exemplars, all kind of being pushed by the end user. Here's an example in the upper right. You can see we're actually doing some large-scale editing from a single picture, and now fine-scale editing. So we're able to kind of recognize a variety of different kinds of scale of texture in images automatically, such that we can integrate them into a variety of kinds of applications. So kind of moving away from the Rhino or Maya specification of materials, I'm also interested in developing new fundamental models that will sort of sustain a range of appearances over time. Any of you have been to Venice, you know that the kind of really pristine sort of images that you generate, computers just don't kind of cut it. So this is a long-term project to kind of develop both new underlying models. Here in this case we're using layers, but also to look at the problem of kind of programming a surface, if you will, over time. So here we have a variety of different kinds of surface changes that are happening over time. And we can sort of say we're going to polish the surface with one operator, tarnish the surface, and so on. So we have all of this kind of high-level control, but in a way that's very intuitive and automatically is attached to certain parts of the surface. We've done other things with surface patterning, using simulations, doing patterning that involves the changes to both shape and appearance. And we've also done a lot of work in things like capturing the way that appearance is automatically attached to shape, learning that, and then being able to synthesize it on brand new shapes. So on the left you see the capture in the lab, and then in the right here you can see examples of where we've taken that detailed appearance over time and then applied it automatically to new materials. But I think in terms of this idea of exemplars, there are lots of additional interesting things that you can do. More recently, we've looked at things like we sort of revisited our work in generating flow patterns and said, well, let's say we have some exemplars. These are real things that you might see outside this building. We can kind of now analyze those patterns, extract parameters from them, put them into a simulation model, and then be able to generate these kinds of effects attached to geometry and adapted to geometry automatically based on an underlying model. Here you can see some examples. We've also done some work recently on what I call tactile mesh saliency. Where will objects look worn or buildings, let's say? How will material vary with use? Where will people touch shapes? How do you collect all this data? We've come up with, we did a bunch of user studies and have built a model and kind of using deep learning to estimate or rank different parts of a surface, and we can kind of predict what will happen to a shape, where its weak points might be, for example. And we've also continued to build out kind of full systems from physical materials to physical realizations. And just show you just an example of a piece of velvet. We're doing a lot of work looking at materials at different scales. And here you can see something like a velvet pillow. And if we zoom in, we start looking at some of the underlying structure. And we've been building interfaces so that you can actually kind of edit things at multiple scales at the same time instead of tuning sliders in Maya, with the idea that you can have a lot of control both over the underlying structure of a material as well as the final look. And this is kind of a forward approach where you start out with, let's say, some material and some texture, and then you end up with a final look that you see here. But even more interesting, I think, is backwards, where you kind of start out with something, a given appearance. Maybe you find something out in the real world or a set of materials, and you'd like to kind of work backwards to being able to create something like that yourself. So here's an example of doing a detailed analysis where we can actually come up with what the reflectance and texture should be. And more recently, we've done some work with cloth models, very, very detailed textiles. And again, using some data-driven models connected to procedural models where we can extract parameters, we can begin to do things like this. We're very, very detailed editing of a very complicated appearance with detailed structure. So these are just kind of first steps. I think this is a fascinating area, and I think really the interfaces of the future for both creating materials and designing materials will largely be, I think, driven to some degree by AI, and I think it's really up to architects and designers to decide what are the right handles. But more important, I think the power of AI in this particular area is really kind of helping you achieve a particular appearance that might be interesting. But not just about things that exist already in the real world, but I think there's potential today with all the advances in fabrication to actually connect an entirely new appearance that we've never thought of or dreamed of before with the ability to actually fabricate or create it. Next, I'm going to talk just briefly about some work in drawing. Again, long, rich history, but this is what a drawing looks like to us today. And I want to talk a little bit about what drawing could be in the future. So drawing, even with the state of CAD and fabrication today, is fundamental to creativity and communication. It's been used by Leonardo to develop movie storyboards, movies from days beyond up to the present, Gary's conceptual sketches, product designs, and so on. But what's really fascinating about drawing is that drawing on a computer today is not so different than drawing was on paper during the Renaissance. Music, photography, and text have been completely revolutionized by computation. But drawing is really largely the same. So one of the things I'm very interested in is looking at the space that sits between 2D sketching and 3D modeling. So 2D sketching is expressive, fluid, but it contains static views. Whereas 3D modeling is very rigid, cumbersome, time-consuming to create, but offers dynamic viewing. And I'm fascinated by what can happen in the space between them. My office is right near Erosarian's hockey arena at Yale, also known as the Whale. And this kind of form is very interesting to me. How can we develop kind of drawing systems that might allow you to explore a form like that without locking into a very detailed geometric representation? These are examples of Henry Moore's idea sketches. Again, very free-flowing. He has talked about sculptures falling out of such sketches. Louis Kahn sketches at varieties of different kinds of scales. So my vision is to enhance visual communication with a computer by elevating the way people draw, adding brand new capabilities. I'm just going to skip ahead, show you a couple of examples. This is a new type of drawing, you probably recognize it, Grand Central Station, but one that you can actually move through, and it has all this animation kind of built in for free. This is just to give you a flavor of how this kind of authoring system works. You can draw just like you might on a piece of paper. You can pick features in the drawing, and then kind of add another drawing that sort of hangs off of that original drawing. So it's like you're drawing on transparent canvases in space. And then add another sheet in the foreground. The idea here is that you can kind of build out a scene very quickly without necessarily knowing where you're going to go a priori. And you can also have a number of different drawings that may or may not go together in the system at once. The idea of the system, sort of idea behind it, is really that that coherence is developed gradually. So these are some, I've just added some water to the scene, but you can see it's on the wrong canvas. So one of the things you can do here is you can select your strokes. And now place a hinge in the drawing, that is select a feature. And using the bird's eye view in the upper right, you can actually reproject those strokes. They're not being translated, they're actually being reprojected. And now you can see they're in the right place. So you can actually draw things and then kind of reinterpret your strokes as you go. So we've also done work along these lines with in situ design, that is placing drawings into real sites, where we can make a very abstract model of a scene very quickly from photographs, elevation data, and site plans. And then you can create drawings like this in situ. Now, one of the things we're working on right now is how can we do better than this? Right now, there's very little when you draw in a digital drawing system. There's really no semantic information. So we've begun to do some work in not turning sketches or drawings into shapes, but actually learning from a large-scale user study the kinds of strokes that people draw, for example, silhouette strokes that indicate the boundaries of a surface, hatching strokes, which give us shading, and stipple strokes, which give us silhouettes from the light source. We're going to analyze these things and be able to recognize them, such that you can create a kind of drawing that is that's 3D, but also very malleable. And it's strokes that support an imagined shape without going to that actual final field shape. So I'm going to conclude there. And bring David back up.
Moving right along is Natasha, Luthra, Director of Emerging Technologies at Jacobs, and the 2018 Chair of the AIA Technology and Architecture Practice Committee. Natasha is the BBC Director of Emerging Technologies at the Platform Technology Group Jacobs, which you probably know of and you know their work. She was also part of this AIA committee, including a knowledge community focused on the intersection of technology in architecture. In this capacity, she hosted the 2018 Building Connections Congress in Washington, D.C., a conference that looked at the themes of the future of design in the age of AI and machine learning. So remember, this is the AIA. Even the kind of traditional AIA is very interested in AI and looking at what that kind of means. We'll hear more about it. And finally, while Natasha trained as an architect, she has found that her true impetus is to be the tip of the spear as it is related to technology and design. And I think that's probably a statement that resonates with many of our students at the school. So thank you for being here, Natasha.
Thank you for having me. When I got invited to this thing, I did exactly what I typically do, which is panic. Because while I am personally really interested in themes of technology in design and architecture practice, I don't think the industry is quite there yet. AI as well, and I don't have this in my presentation, but we'll talk about it later, but during my Building Connections Congress, which is about 100 people showing up and talking about various themes, I think there's always this sort of sense of fear before excitement, and that's an interesting concept of when we think about technology and what it means for us. But similarly, we've been talking about this within the industry, within where we work and what we do on a regular basis, and there are a few studies that show that within the next 10 years, and Jacobs is primarily an engineering company, but there's a study that says 4 out of the 10 big engineering companies in the next 10 years will be disrupted, which makes us wonder which side do we want to be on. So when we started thinking about that, we decided that we needed to be able to manage what we called an innovation portfolio. We need to be able to drive the idea of technology and how we think about innovation within what we do on a regular basis. We were thinking about a technology, an innovation portfolio that focuses on the near, medium, far, and transformation term. I sit in the Buildings, Infrastructure and Advanced Facilities Group of Jacobs, which is only 33,000 people strong, which is a little bit of a challenge when you think about how do you try and drive innovation in such a big company, and how do you bring that innovation to the fore? How do you think about themes like we're talking about right now on such a large scale? We've been doing all sorts of studies really on sort of what we call part-time passion technology projects, right? Where you AR, VR, we do augmented reality studies, and we've been looking at additive construction and working with NASA to do that. But those are all sort of part-time studies that we do, and when we have billable work and when we have proposals, all of this sort of has to wait. So we started thinking about how we need to do, and we thought that we need to see the change. We need to change how we thought about it. So for the first time in the history of our company, we had a CTIO, this Chief Technology and Innovation Officer at corporate level that has never existed in our history before. And from there down, we started thinking about ways we would have to focus on what we needed to do. So this is my job right now. I run an incubator program and an emerging ideas program within the company. The incubator program is not quite like you would expect as a typical sort of a technology accelerator program. The incubator program is sort of very internally focused. When you have 33,000 people to begin with, you can probably find enough people to have a conversation around technologies within your organization. So my first workshop, I had about 12 people, and I had everybody from a blockchain expert who happens to be a civil engineer, to people who were talking about urban planning and essentially anything you can think of, interior designers, people like that. And the incubator program is really looking at these transformational ideas. It is looking at, we identified about 9 separate themes that we thought we needed to focus on. And from those, we are currently sort of working our way down to about 4 or 5 ideas. We think that we'll be able to come down to maybe 1 or 2 ideas that truly are what could potentially transform who we are as a company. I can't talk about them, but they're interesting to say the least. On the other hand, the Emerging Ideas program is the other part of the program that I run. And that program, when I say emerging, I truly mean ideas emerging from the practice. These are people who are working on projects with clients every single day and are sort of coming up with these ideas saying, if I could just do this, if I could just take data and I could use this in 3 different ways, I could potentially do something with that. So the idea is, can we take those ideas, lift them out of a client situation or a project situation, fund that a little bit, and see where we can take that. So we've been doing different ideas from there. But really, the goal of that program, essentially, is to teach us how to think about ideas, right? We're all incredibly creative people in everything that we do. Coming up with ideas is the easy part. What do you do with those ideas when you have them is the much, much harder task that we're trying to figure out, which is how do you think through an idea, and in an industry situation, how do you build a business case around it, or how do you describe how this is going to change what we do. So the program that we're building off of, and we're actually working a little bit off the Adobe Kickbox idea, which if you're familiar with, is it helps you structure the idea in a way that you can proceed from it, sort of, sort of this big flash that you have and work through it. What we do is we think of it in 3 different steps, sort of generating, validating, and implementing. The generation is the different ways we're doing it. The validating is how do you validate this is a good idea. I've built within the company what I call a disciplined brain trust. So I send this out to 40, 50 people, say, what do you think? Does this make sense? Can we proceed with this? Do you think this needs to be funded? How much, if you will, and things like that. And then we take it into what is, for us, in some ways, arguably the hardest thing is the implementation idea. So how do you start implementing this on more than one project, or that one marquee project that we talked about, that we can use it at? And then this is the other really, really hard part of what we do. The idea with being that we need to be comfortable with the idea of failure. We need to be able to say that it's okay if this idea doesn't work out. We invested a little bit of time and money in it, but this isn't the direction we need to go, or this isn't quite working out. So how do you take it through that? This is also really, really hard for us, right? This is also really hard for us because we are all, when you come into a company, into an industry, you're expected that you will be successful at every step that you go. So for us to make that cultural change between that has been an interesting way for us to proceed. So we're trying to build a culture of innovators, not just innovation. So people who can think, who can dream big, who can take an idea, structure it all the way through to a place where we could actually implement it on our projects and not to be afraid of failure. So we start typically with a small seed investment. We ask for a proof of concept, some sort of minimum, deliverable of some sort, and then we take it from there. And then if the idea really does strike an impetus, if it really focuses on, and themes of AI are big there, or at least taking the idea of data and switching it to knowledge and talent and what that means for us. Other than pure data, what does it mean in technology, in a knowledge perspective? We take it into what we are currently planning. We hope to take it into what we are currently planning. We are planning 5 innovation centers across the world. I should have mentioned, we have, while I sit in our buildings business, we have a parallel line of business, which is aerospace and technology, our Intel line of business, which is incredibly focused around the idea of cybersecurity, IoT, and predictive analytics. So we're trying to merge those sort of technologies and the expertise that we have in both lines of business and find ways that we can work together. So these 5 separate innovation centers will focus on these 5 themes, and the incubator and the emerging ideas program trying to feed into these ideas that we could work off of. So while this is all really exciting, I want to take a few seconds to show you things that are not quite as exciting, but hopefully getting us there. These are actual projects that we're working on. So when we speak and when we think about AI, and hopefully in our discussion, I'm sure we'll bring this up, but for us, it's the idea of data and moving that into knowledge. And when we think about that, we think about how we want to acquire that data or generate that data, how are we going to evaluate that data and then take it into implementation. Right? So these are some of the ways we are thinking of acquiring our data. This is a project that we're doing for Transport for London, and we use mobility data, so we captured 400 odd million mobile points across the city of London to try and track how people are traveling through the city to be able to help Transport of London with their congestion plans. And then when we are doing the evaluation of that data, simulation, of course, is fairly expected. This is the other project that we're working on, which is the Port of San Francisco seawall project. So we're trying to build a seawall around sort of this coast area, and we've been trying to do resiliency simulations across that. So how does this work? Will this work in various different events? So that's still at the simulation level, but we're hoping that we can take that into a more AI sort of level where we can start thinking about how this could potentially work.
I guess just one quick thought is you have 2 really big levers. One is a 33,000 person group, and now there's the AIA, which is a bigger organizing force. And so it's really the final speaker for the afternoon, before we go into the discussion, is Douwe Osinga, Principal Engineer at Sidewalk Labs. Before working for Sidewalk as the tech lead on generative urban design, Douwe Osinga founded Triposo, a mobile travel guide in Berlin. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Before that, he worked for Google in Switzerland, India, and Australia. And he is the author of the well-known book, Deep Learning Cookbook. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you here today.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I hope I can follow up on the other presentations just now. Where's this flipper thingy? I want to talk about 5 things in 15 minutes, so let's have to be, keeping up the tempo a little bit. I'm from Sidewalk Labs. We're working to, explore what a city of the future could be like. And one of the ways that we do this is using urban generative design. We'll start with the underlying problem that we're trying to solve. We're trying to build a district, or let alone a city. You have all these interlocking systems that you're all trying to develop at the same time, and they all have their own requirements, and a lot of them, they're simulation-based, and simulation currently it's expensive, it's slow, and it makes for a situation where you have all these systems that talk to each other, and it creates all this latency where somebody changes something in how you do the buildings, that actually trickles into obviously the cost of structure, but also how the traffic systems around this thing work. And typically what you get is that these people then get together 4 weeks later and they have redone their simulations, but all the base assumptions have changed already, and it just all goes each and every way. And it makes it just hard to get to a shared set of goals that you can, even if you get to the shared goals, how do you make sure that you're collectively going to those things? And that's sort of the problem space that we're trying to work through. How do we put this all together? Oops. Do I point this at something else? No.
Because you're running the browser.
All right. I was going to say, it might not surprise you that our answer is generative design. The name of our team, but I think I kind of gave the answer away by randomly clicking through this slide back. Right, so what we do is we start with a bunch of inputs, and they vary from the existing conditions, like what does the site look like, what's the sort of climate that we have. Maybe we throw in some future climate scenarios too, because, you know, climate change. And then we have a bunch of things that we play with, like the type of street grid that we want to apply to this, the type of buildings, how much green space that we want to allocate, how does it work with the transit. And so we have this nice big space, input space, that we then use to generate thousands, if not millions, of different potential designs that we then can sort of explore by going through this huge n-dimensional space where every dot represents a solution to this. And then this is where the simulations come in. So of each of these things, we have these basic objective functions. We try to combine them into something that is more interesting than just an objective function, that tells you something about the quality of life. And then we run this simulation and we generate all these options, and we create this situation where you can actually explore these results. So this is our playground city. Doesn't actually exist. It's called Bettisville. And it allows you to go through all these different things. You can switch on layers. You can see what the street grid is, what the massing is like, and you can sort of look at what the performance of this is. And it gets you somewhere. So the next thing, and this is where I'll promise artificial intelligence will make a first appearance, is what do you do with this? How do you optimize this? Because ultimately, you know, you want to take the manual out of this process. You want to focus on the important thing. And, you know, where the toilet goes, maybe, could be. So what we do is we have all these outcomes, and you can squeeze through them. And but look, what we're really after is not having, and this goes to the discussion that we'll hopefully have, we're not aiming for the computer to tell you, well, this is the answer, go build it. We want to get an idea of what the trade-off is. What is the shape of the solution space here? And one of the important things there is this trade-off between exploration and exploitation. Right? Do you want to immediately go for the hill climbing? Do you want to find the optimal solution? Or do you want to explore the entire space? And so one technique that is useful there is this concept of Bayesian optimization that I wanted to quickly run through. Essentially, in this case, we're just simplifying things dramatically. And we're just assuming that the shape of our space is, well, effectively one-dimensional. It's just this blue line. And we've run 2 experiments, and so all we know are the 2 red dots there. And if we only wanted to optimize, we could go like, well, maybe the left one looks better than the right one. Let's explore around the left one. But if you run the Bayesian optimization, it will tell you 2 things. It will tell you what you know and where you expect scores to be higher, but it also tells you where there are interesting things to explore. So in this case, actually, if you look at this, the most uncertainty and the highest yield of knowledge and score is to the left side. And so if we do another observation there, suddenly the entire certainty building explodes. And now the model realizes that really we should explore more in the middle. And so when it does that, it sort of water balloons into the shape of what we want to do. And this process allows you to continuously make this trade-off between finding the highest scoring solution versus exploring where there is stuff that you don't know. The known and the unknowns and all that. And you keep doing that, and at some point you actually do end up with a nice, you start sketching out this line and you discover where everything is. And in this case you still have some uncertainty on the right, which is not actually going to bring us very much. Right. Moving on to slightly more experimental, also machine learning. So, generative adversarial networks, they were all the rage a year or so ago in machine learning land. And so we decided to take them for a spin and see if we could do something with putting walls inside of apartments. And so what we did is, look at that. We got our hands on a whole bunch of apartment layouts and wrote this algorithm, which is not really machine learning, that removes all the internal walls. And so then the idea is that you train a generator that proposes where to put the walls. And you have this other algorithm, the discriminator, that gets the fake apartment layout and the real apartment layout. And it has to guess which one is real. And in the beginning, both of these algorithms are very good, but it's this, this competition between the two that allows them to get better. And so over time, the generator starts generating things that are very hard to distinguish, while the discriminator becomes better and better at distinguishing, and they both get better. And so this is one example of that. So you have the input, which is just basically the outer walls. And we have what it actually should be. This placement is a little too bright for this picture, but one thing that I find fascinating, the details are a little washed out, but one thing that I find fascinating is that our stripper actually removed the windows here, and the algorithm sort of put these double lines indicating that there's windows here, back where the windows are supposed to be. So it actually recovers even the details that we inadvertently stripped out. It does have a certain tendency to put, staircases everywhere, because it does see that a lot. It has no idea what your floor is, of course. And so, similarly, if you give it something that has all the furniture inside, it has no idea about the furniture, it just, puts the staircase back. So, some more examples, and basically, once you do this, you get this machine that will just randomly draw all these possible floor plans. All right. Try the same with, and this is sort of interesting with Google Maps. So with Google Maps, you can, they have this custom view mode where you can hide certain details. And so that's kind of nice for this sort of approach, because you can take a tile and then tell Google Maps to render the same tile with buildings or without buildings, which we can then feed into this GAN, and the GAN now has to guess where the buildings go. And over time, it actually develops a notion of where the buildings go. And these are actually, not too bad. One of the dead giveaways here is that this area doesn't have any buildings. But since the GAN was trained to put buildings, it will generally always put buildings. So, final example, this is another thing that is one of those machine learning things that are fairly popular because the visual effects are really good. The basic thing is that you have an image of a certain style, and you have a target image, like the Golden Gate Bridge, and the style transfer algorithm is capable of redrawing that image in the style of the style source image. And so sometimes that works really well. Then Go is always a very nice way of going it, because it's, of course, a very expressive style. If you take Escher, It's less clear that it can work. And so one thing that we were thinking is, can you apply this to cities? The street networks of cities, can you capture them as a form of style? That would be a bad setup if it wasn't the answer yes. So, again, this does not render quite as nicely on my screen, but you can sort of see that, you know, for Amsterdam, you get like these fluid, roundish lines and lots of water features thrown in, while for New York, you get sort of like the basic grid that you expect, sort of even in the orientation that you expect, and then sometimes it throws in a little Mornington Park-like thingy. And it has some Broadway type of lines that cross the sort of thing. And then finally for Istanbul, the downtown is very medieval, crooked streets that sometimes don't go anywhere, and it has sort of this weird, nice structure that it captures. One thing that is sort of unexplained here is where the different gray bits come from. We don't know. All right. How are we for time? 2.5 minutes. We can do this. All right. So this goes somewhat towards one of the questions that I think is really interesting around machine learning and optimization. This trade-off between coming up with something original and optimization that always leads to the same thing. So this is part of our generator that proposes where to put parts. And it does quite a reasonable job. You know, sometimes it puts a big park in the middle, sometimes it puts parks on the side, sometimes it puts little scattered plots of green everywhere. But the problem is that if you make a little change in the inputted algorithm, it's not really predictable what will happen. The parks might just dramatically change, and that means that if you're going to do one of those hill climbing things, you think that you might be going in the right direction, but since these parks just completely change, you can't really optimize, and that's sort of frustrating. The other thing is this observation from Madame Koolhaas, that if you optimize everything, you end up with one solution, and everything looks the same, which is not optimal. So there's a paradox there. And so one thing that we should be playing with, you might recognize this image, is to move away from the notion of optimization and more go towards growing and mutating and making this more like, you know, be more inspired by biology than economics, I guess. And so an experiment that we ran is where we took an existing design for a parcel in Toronto that we're working with. And we ran this mutator over it, which basically just takes the buildings and just randomly changes them a little bit. It might add a floor, it might delete a floor, it might expand the building, it might move the building around a little bit. And it just, you know, it just creates all these different variations. And then you run the same objective functions over it, and you get a much more diverse outcomes that have actually improvements over the original plan, but they don't all look the same. So you can see that, you know, the top two have, you know, nice improvements. The bottom one is way more dramatic and comes up with these super tall buildings that probably you really wouldn't do, but it gives you this much more creative and interesting solution. That's what
So I think this was kind of fittingly diverse group of presentations to, you know, get us started on what I hope will be a longer-term conversation at school about some of these topics. So I have a number of questions, and I could probably keep them for quite a while, but I want all of the audience members to know that I will restrain myself and soon will return to ask questions to get your questions ready. I guess one of the first things that I want to do specifically is education, and specifically agricultural education. So one way to kind of frame I think a very complex question is to put it like really simply, what, in this context, this world that you've kind of seen for us, sort of, what should we be training architecture students to do? Should we be training them in math? Should we be training them in statistics? Should we be training them in coding? And/or should we be training them in those kind of qualitative, exploration-based ideas of human cognition and synthesis that are more in line with the humanities and the literary novel? So I don't know if you, none of you is necessarily exactly thinking about training architects, and Julie will come closest. But, you know, in an educational institution. But I wonder, like, I mean, given all of the work that's shown, I think you probably all have some thoughts about that. So,
I mean, so I think, you know, the first thing, first of all, I think it's still really quite early in development. If you look at deep learning, you know, new tricks come out of it all the time. And keeping an eye on what might be applicable and what might not be seems useful. But I expect that over time, a lot of these things will just become modules that have a behavior that you can plug in, that you can use for your work. And, you know, math is probably overrated if you're not going with that.
so like there's, I mean, other fields of analysis, but there's like an abstraction hierarchy. There are different people at different levels that can get granular with the code or just be plugging in modules that are controllable. So I think that's part of the conversation.
I mean, I can speak from just being an architect and doing what I do, right?
Yeah.
So I think that just from being an architect, I don't necessarily, I think it's the latter, I think it's the humanities, I think it's the ability to be adaptable. You know, I mean, I've been working with this company for 10 years and I have done the same job 2 years in a row, I'd say. And that's sort of the thing, that the math and coding, I'm not quite sure, is quite where we have to go right now. But the ability to think laterally is what we really need.
So we have a somewhat new major at Yale called Computing in the Arts, which requires students to take half of their major courses in computer science and half in one branch of the arts, art history, architecture, theater studies, what have you. And I think many so-called digital arts programs say, you know, you just take a bunch of digital courses. And the idea here is that you would get a kind of in-depth study of the humanities and the arts, while at the same time getting an in-depth exposure to computer science. And I think in the future, the best and most interesting tools that will actually further the field of architecture are going to be made by people who have an in-depth, they must have an in-depth exposure to both. Otherwise, you end up with kind of more of the kind of Maya-esque sort of interfaces that I showed. But I think what does an architecture student need to do, need to know today? So in some of the models that you showed, one of the things I was thinking about is they all have sort of strengths and limitations, and if you know something about the underlying models and what's out there, you can actually be critical about the answers you're getting. Because if you're sitting there sort of navigating some curve and optimizing over some set of characteristics and whatnot, you really need to be critical about the answer. Like, is this the right answer? Maybe it's not. So I think, like, the architect cannot wrestle, like, cannot give up control, I think. So in order to do that, you must have a knowledge of what actually you're looking at. What are the underlying models? I don't necessarily think that architects need to be able to program those models, but they do need the controls.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it also resonates with the kind of approach at this school to all kinds of problems, including computation-related problems. I think, you know, if anything, Columbia GSAPP is known for having a critical approach to design in general, that was computation. I want to drill down for a second on the topic of machine learning, since that's, you know, I mean, like artificial intelligence. It's an overused term, probably. It's got such a buzz now. But I think when we say machine learning, it gets a little more focused than when we say artificial intelligence. And I want to try out on the preview a hypothesis that I've been developing about machine learning that I think is very relevant to its use in architecture and design. And my hypothesis is something like machine learning, of course, requires data. I mean, that's the main point of it, right? Data equals past results. If we're interested in innovation, discovery, the kind of exploration that you described, is there some incompatibility there? Because although we think at first glance, oh, maybe machine learning can help us discover something really important that I didn't already know, that was already there, but we just can't see it with our human cognition, that the algorithm can detect this pattern. That's really appealing, you know, for the kind of creative designer who wants to explore a new design space. But at the same time, I think maybe there's a flaw there because, you know, in the floor plan example, all the algorithm is doing, you know, it's only as good as what you tell it you want to do. And all it's doing is trying to interpret like past floor plans. So it's going to basically, it's a version of the problem that, you know, some critics of AI and machine learning have applied to society more generally. If you require a judge sentencing people who are convicted to use past data, then you're going to perpetuate some stereotypes, you know, based on past results and flaws in the data. If we're going to require that, you know, designer make designs based on past floor plans, we're never going to get, I don't know what we'd say is like the best architectural innovations, but, you know, the open plan, Buckminster Fuller's dome over Manhattan. That's not a machine learning, you know, machine learning technique could never come up with that. So, I don't know, do you have any thoughts about this, both the potential promise of machine learning for design, but also this kind of version that I'm painting where it could be valuable for some things, like an efficiency approach, but actually this promise of like discovering something great in the data might be overrated.
So many thoughts. So I think you make a fair point, especially around simple things like, you know, style transfer or these sort of scams. I think everybody's favorite counterexample would be AlphaGo, right, where the machine actually does come up with creative strategies that humans have never thought of or have thought of but rejected as being impossible. So, and again, that's a very restricted game space, literally, and so maybe that's to be you know, expected earlier. One thing that I personally find really fascinating in this sort of thing are embedding spaces, so where every point represents a solution. And if you can get to a solution, to a system where machine learning helps you project existing examples in that space, but is capable of showing you what's in the other points that you haven't visited, there is actually this possibility to discover something. I mean, a very simple thing is, like, things that we look at are, you know, how do streets in cities, how do they behave, what is the layout? And if you have an algorithm that can reproduce things work in Paris, but also one in Manhattan, what happens if you look at 80% Manhattan and 20% Paris? Or, you know, you throw in a little bit of Amsterdam, and you have this, so, and again, that's sort of what I was trying to hint at in my presentation, that to me, if you can create these spaces and sort of open them up using machine learning, now you have something to explore that isn't necessarily only the observations that you've seen.
I think it is you show the adversarial learning networks, right? So the two ones that are fighting, not fighting each other, but are comparing to each other. And think about that as sort of a human-machine combination as well. And I think that's what you're doing. But I think that makes sense. So a partnership in one way or the other is where I see that we'd see most happening.
Yeah, and I would agree there are possibilities, particularly in things like strategy games where you can actually develop some novel concepts as you go. But I really very much like this idea. Like, for example, there was a recent paper about designing fonts, where the system generates this manifold and you can kind of move around on this like abstract mathematical construct. But to your right, what you're seeing is a letter being varied in a very complicated way that you might not ever think of doing. So I think one of the things that's really interesting here is the interfaces, because I think the opportunity for invention will really not necessarily be seen by the algorithm, but by that end user. You might just, like, you can see things in this font generator that, you know, again, you would maybe generate tons and tons of versions and just not see the complex combination of parameters that's possible.
Yeah, and that was really powerful in your work, where you see the human interacting with this complex data-driven system at multiple scales and having new insights because of the way the C impacts. So I haven't seen the paper you're talking about, but I can totally imagine working on the math side and then seeing the font develop. And there's this new hybrid that you're describing of the human developing a new tool, a new lever to discover something new. Along those lines, one thing that we found in my studio, using some of the same generative design systems that we got Douwe, and looking at data points which each represent a possible design solution. Just somewhat by chance, we switched from using a version of just plotting points two-dimensionally, one by one, so you would see like data points in the n-dimensional space plotted on two example axes and then two other axes. We started using an online tool to do that, and the online tool had a feature that we decided to use, the ability to see the points morph between one graph and the other graph. And we thought, this is really cool, but why is it cool? It's cool because the human mind can detect things in that representation that you wouldn't see if you just saw two static graphs. By seeing the points move, say, from their input space visualization to their output space visualization, and if they're color-coded in a certain way, we started to see these patterns that were totally just quantitative, driven by the data, but also taking advantage of human, probably neuroscience, right? Something about our brain's ability to detect movement. So it's not only color, it's movement. And I think we probably know that because, like, the human mind is trained to see a tiger coming in our peripheral vision. So there's something about this new thing that developed, and we're trying to investigate that more, but you know, how the human pattern recognition is really interesting, as well as the machine pattern recognition, combining them and having interfaces. I totally think that's a great word for it. Let's see, I want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience. Are there any questions? Can be about trends or specific work and project.
This is kind of a broad question, but okay, within the borders of what the profession is and how architects profession, how architects practice in the, I guess, the United States. How far away are these tools, or how are these tools kind of maybe going to say replace? I mean, is there like any way that these kind of tools can replace like what we do now as architects, or are we like really far away from that? Or do you see me like?
I'm happy to take that one.
Okay.
I think short answer, no. I don't think it's replacing us anytime soon, and I firmly believe actually it will never replace us. As an architect, I speak. But I do think, as in where the industry is, in what I see, I would say that we're at the tipping point for around generative design. I would say that's a point that is getting really comfortable for where we are, at least what I'm seeing in everything that we do. From where there are many methods before you get to sort of machine learning and artificial intelligence, but generative is where we are, which is, in sort of how I understand it, is optionality, right? It's creating millions of options and giving you 10 best options. So that's what we will do if we're not doing that already.
Can I add my favorite example to that? So before the spreadsheet was a spreadsheet, you had people that did spreadsheets on paper. And if you had a business and you would go to your accountant and say like, hey, what happens if the interest rate rises by 1%? And he would go to his big paper spreadsheet and fill in all the numbers and calculate it through it. And like, hey, I know the answer for you. And then you go like, oh, but what happens if it's 1.5%? He goes back to his room and he does the same thing again. And you don't get very much knowledge out of that. And then computers had spreadsheets. That did not kill the financial industry at all. Instead, it led to this huge opportunity because you can explore these spaces, whether they're financial or architectural, much better if you have the right tools.
We'll go to your question in 1 second, but I just want to, I want to say that I agree with that vision. That's what we should advocate for, but I think we have to advocate for it. And in other words, the flip side of that question is, if 90% of buildings are already built without hiring an architect, so we're already in a problem space. Is it going to be now 95%? Because there are these forces, there's these forces that we never talk about in this school, by the way. But if there are those forces already, like they're there for a reason, because people, making buildings is expensive. A lot of people making buildings want to have a return on investment quickly. It's a profit-driven industry. That's all industries, but the stakes are super high. So little by little, as we talk about like the most high-end examples of AI and discovering something new, and I'm criticizing myself here too, by the way, but are we just missing slowly the forces that already have the 90% of the buildings are going to raise it to 97%, and we're just the frogs in the slowly heating water, right? And all of a sudden, it's 99.9, the school's closed. Go home, architects.
I actually think it's the opposite. I think it's the moving towards the 85%. I mean, if we're not going to spend, hopefully we're not going to spend our time moving towards around for ages, right? So I think that, for example, when we sell a project now, and obviously we're not counting these themes when we're selling it, but we are always selling the idea of shorter, cheaper, faster. We get you into your building as fast as you can. So we take less money because it'll cost you less money. So I think that will allow us to work on more stuff. It'll allow us to reach 15% of the buildings rather than 10%.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. But I think you're advocating for that. I mean, that was the thing that maybe wasn't said in the first round of answers. Like, you have to advocate for that. Your business model might be, we can use these tools to do it faster, so we don't have to charge you as much, and therefore, some of the 90% will hire an architect, because before it was just too expensive.
We still make the case for why we need to exist. Yes, we have to make that every single time we propose a building.
But I would also think that if you can actually bring in these objective functions and these learners that actually tell you, that allow you to prove that what you're doing is better than the baseline, it's not just about making things cheaper and faster. If you can prove that you have a higher added value, then it's hard to say no.
Absolutely.
Yeah, totally. Well, and you can, like you said in your slides, show the client this trade-off, this data-driven trade-off between things that are important. So I think it will require, again, like a little bit of active, advocating for the value of it and saying, like, look, you're getting so much more for this.
Sorry. I think one of the places where we have struggled with in the past, and we're trying to change that a little bit, especially around this data-driven environment, is to try and extend our effect on a building after it's built. So we talk about asset management as being something entirely different, but when you can draw data throughout the life of the building, when we say that it can do this kind of level of sustainable design, and then when you can spend 15 years proving that it does, I think that there is value there that's driven by this, and that helps us make the case more when we're selling these buildings.
Yeah, which, by the way, both of these comments might suggest that maybe we need to be teaching trade-offs. Maybe we need to be teaching post-occupancy and that kind of stuff as well.
Well, I believe that the ingenuity of an architect is his ability to overview a very complex problem with a very large parameter space. And sometimes the empirical knowledge of doing that is more important than generating model options. Do you see any way of using machine learning to encode this empirical knowledge of the design decision process in your machine learning tools?
So two thoughts. One is, in the ideal case, you hope that your algorithm can learn from existing buildings and figure that out. The other thing that I've been starting to look at is bringing reinforcement learning, where you actually try to have a model that actually learns what the modifications that you make, which ones are good and which ones are bad, and it's not just this point in space, but it's like this actual journey from a building and the cutout and the reshaping and the orientation. So I think there's,
That's exactly.
Yeah, and I think there are also possibilities for, like in the stroke analysis that I briefly touched on at the end of my presentation. So we can do some analysis in which, 10 different people are drawing silhouette strokes, and we can recognize that. But we can also look at your strokes in particular and learn a lot about what you're trying to express semantically. So I think there are possibilities of that. Ideally, these systems are actually assisting you in your own design process, in your own methods, your own style, rather than just kind of importing other examples that have been done previously.
I think this prompts a question for myself, which is, it seems broadly speaking, there's really two themes here. There's one where AI is a form of automation, and it's like the existential crisis of architects, where we're going to replace certain tasks with scripts and maybe intelligent agents. And the other, which you both just touched on, is this idea of augmented design. New design tools that don't necessarily solve the problem, but they open up a whole way of design we never thought of before, right? Like drawing 3D from a screen is kind of like an amazing experience that I didn't realize I could do. And so I wonder, maybe at Jacobs, in terms of all the things you're investing in, what percentage is automation, what percentage is augmentation? And I don't really know which way the industry is trending. I know which way I personally would love to see it go, but my fears are maybe that it's not going towards augmentation, it's going towards automation.
You will be exactly right.
Right.
But I think that's because it's the easiest, so people like it's there.
Right.
You can see it, you can comprehend it. And I agree with you. I think that there is a whole lot of sort of conversation on sort of augmented design that we haven't gotten there yet, which is why we're starting with that.
Thank you so much for all this presentation. It's very interesting. Yesterday at Columbia, there was a conversation directed by a neuroscientist who specializes in AI, called Human Rights for the Future, discussing the ethics of neurotech and AI. So this person spoke about the emergence of brain-to-computer interfaces, and so artificial intelligence is very much inspired by neurology. So with the emergence of this knowledge comes the issue of a number of ethical issues with the brain-to-computer interface and the access to augmentation, but also, the feedback of that, which is the access to thoughts. So a sort of expansion of privacy issues that we're facing at the moment. And then the idea of neural rights, so in terms of identity and free will, sort of with the emergence of AI and the mapping of the brain, an understanding that our free will is determined by that, as we don't necessarily have free will as individuals, but maybe we have free will as a species. And anyway, so they talk about sort of also equal access to the augmentation of AI and to digital tools, etc. So there's a sort of emergence of human rights issues around AI, and so in relation to that, around AI and neurology, I'm interested in talking about architecture as a practice that's very much rooted in a territory that's at peace, right? So architecture only emerges when there's no war, and the territory and the society is stable enough for us to be constructing buildings, right? It pre-requires a stability that we can't take for granted. But so if we sort of zoom out of that and then consider the fact that architecture happens without architects, and we try to understand our positioning as people who can go back and forth between the humanities and the sciences, right? We have this sort of cognitive ability that's a bit unique and that is not necessarily encouraged by the structure of academia. So in relation to that, I'm interested in looking at architecture as this practice that's rooted in the sort of, in this idea of like peaceful territory, and that looks to preserve that peace by having interventions that are future-oriented and sort of foresee the possibility for conflict. So in that case, it's like the conflicts that AI and neuroscience or the brain-to-computer, the risks of the brain-to-computer interface can bring forward. So I'm wondering if that's something you're interested in, like commenting on, or if you see a sort of agency that our field has with the emergence of these human rights issues in relation to AI that we're suited to tackle, that maybe not, that because they're extremely complex issues that definitely require a lot of a specific knowledges, and I'm not sure that people trained in human rights or people trained in neurology are necessarily, best fit to approach these problems that require a sort of access to all of these disciplines. And as architects, we have always been orchestrating these various knowledges together, like working with engineers, working with politicians, working with financiers, working with the people impacted by, and sort of synthesizing all of these voices through our intervention. So I wonder if you would like to talk about that, or in relation to education, or in relation to how we position ourselves professionally with regards to these massive transformations that are happening.
Sounds like quite a talk.
I think we found this consensus with this, and I think you touched on that a little bit. So I'm not, in theory, I think that we have to be able to expand who we build a consensus with in general, so drawing from all of these fields. I think that there's a slightly different consensus around the idea of peace building, and I would actually push back against architecture's peace, and I'll use a really practical example. One of the things we're doing with, well, not necessarily AI, but certainly around the idea of anti-construction, is we're working with the Army Corps of Engineers to try to see that can you use machines to go in and build in war-torn zones. So you don't have to send your people in harm's way, but you're able to build structures that are needed in that space. I don't know if that's really where you're thinking, but just the idea of what technology and architecture can do, I think that has wider implications to those aspects.
I think we're just about running out of time, but if there's one more question, I think we could continue that.
Okay, this is half more, but kind of touching on David, what you were saying about machine learning being essentially predictive of prior models. I'm curious if you all think about machine learning either without data, where data doesn't come first, but comes at the end, or the model comes first, the assumptions come first, not the data. If there's any thoughts on kind of contortions with that, or AI, ML models that I guess maybe are not predictive, or predictive but don't continge on a large set of prior assumptions and predictions, a large set of prior observations made about the world, condensed into a form of data that are then used to construct a model. Just zooming out for a second, it feels like that it's the predominant form of how models are structured, which then has a lot of repercussions as to bias baked into the model, baked into the data, baked into et cetera. But also the economics of scale involved in gathering this kind of data, and thus what kind of actors can use what kind of data, what kind of actors can collect such kind of data, and also what data sets don't exist in the first place. So I'm curious if there are any thoughts on, are there alternatives to a data first model in your practice? What would that be, and how would that happen?
So we do a lot of data collection in our work, and often my students will like kind of have an answer in mind, like or a model in mind. But actually, I try to encourage them to be very open in looking at it that we don't know yet. Like we start collecting a lot of data, maybe starting with some question. But then I think models really can be built on what you learn from that data. And there's, sort of an art and science, I think, to asking the right questions about that data, like to get the right insights. But you needn't build the model first. I think you can actually start collecting information and with an open mind, sort of look at things as they emerge, and then sort of drive a model from that.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about the possibility of doing it inversely, which feels like it's never happens. For very little reasons.
Deep Blue, the name was based on deep thought from his Circuitry Galaxy. And that computer, they switched on without connecting to any data.
Right. Right.
Got to income tax before somebody managed to switch it off.
And then, I'm not an expert in this, obviously, by any means, but I think that the assumptions are always based on data, whether that means as historical or education. When we make assumptions on how modern needs to be built, we are building on some sort of history. So, while I understand what you're asking, I don't think I think the assumptions and the data are laid in a way that it's just technical to divorce.
I think the other question, where you look at what, some data is just much easier to get, and how much does that drive the development is, we have the Wikipedia, so,
Right. So certain computation doesn't require data.
Sure.
Like a hammer doesn't generate data. It is an operation and a computation in and of itself. So I think there's are there ways of thinking about artificial intelligence that is data-less and full of computation?
Maybe just to have one quick kind of final question as our wrap up. I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts about practice or industry versus academia. What kind of things, all of this discussion should be happening in practice, what kind of things should be happening in academia, what should the roles be? Another way of framing that would be who's leading? In the context of AI and architecture, who's leading at the moment? But I think maybe more broadly is, what are the models we should be looking for?
I would say the industry is leading, but not the architecture industry. I think that's where we are at right now.
Yeah, I would agree. And also, just with computation more generally, often architects are sort of adopting tools often that are generated in completely different industries. But ideally, I think architects should be driving that. I think often in schools of architecture, it's often practice driven but I think there's a real need for sort of long-term thinking about some of these questions.
Great. Well, that's a perfect way to end, right? That's a challenge as well in this here in this minute. So thank you very much.